At this time, I'd like to introduce Burley Hanna to tell us about another helper during at Dorchester.
Good afternoon. Thank you, Reverend Horn. As you know, when I was honored last year, there was a fifth hero mentioned in doing that. There was also a book that was suggested to read about this young man. So I want to give you a little insight into who that fifth history hero was. The World War II story of the fifth fearless hero in the sinking of the Dorchester was Charles Walter David Jr. Charles was born in New York City on June 30th, 1918, the first of his family to be born in the United States. His mother Elizabeth and father Charles Sr. traveled from the Caribbean to the United States. Like many other immigrants who passed the Statue of Liberty and walked through Ellis Island to begin their new lives. The couple eventually settled into a neighborhood in the Northeast Bronx. Charles attended elementary school and the Cooper's Industrial High School. He developed his cabinet making and carpentry skills apprenticing under his dad. When he graduated from high school, he had means of taking care of himself and his future family. In 1939, at the age of 22, he married Kathleen Wiggins. 1 year later, they had a son, Neil Adrian, and the couple moved to Harlem. Charles knew he needed to provide for his wife and son. To that end, he turned to the military. In most respects, it was still segregated. Only a few of the branches allowed white and black soldiers to serve together. The Coast Guard was one of them. He enlisted on March 6, 1941 in New York. After the attack on Pearl Harbor later that year, Charles was assigned to the United States Coast Guard cutter Comanche. Charles rose from being a cook to a steward, to a steward's mate, and to a petty officer, where his duty was to serve the captain and other officers on the ship rather than the enlistees. But the Coast Guard still would not let him progress beyond being the fifth lowest ranking person on board. On the morning of January the 23rd, 1943, the Dorchester was among a long convoy of 50 other ships. On board were 751 troops, as well as her own crew and gunners, for a total of 904 men. The Dorchester had been built to hold a third of its current contingent. Only a couple of feet separated one set of beds from the other. On January the 29th, the Dorchester, Biscaya, and Lutz headed for the Army base in Greenland with troops and supplies. To protect them were 3 U.S. Coast Guard cutters, the Tampa, Comanche, and the Escanaba. On January the 30th, the wind started out of the north, visibility near zero. The temperature plummeted. Sea spray from the waves turned to ice. On February the 2nd, at 3:30 in the afternoon, the northern winter darkness had already begun to consume everything. The ship was entering into the troubled waters where U-boats were known to prowl. They were ordered to put on their life jackets and clothes just to be safe. Around 11:30 p.m., they came through the storm and were in calm waters. On February 3rd, a U-boat fired its torpedo towards the Dorchester. The Dorchester was hit by the torpedo and would sink in roughly 25 minutes. The convoy followed protocol. At 2:30 a.m., the Comanche received orders to return to the site of the sinking of the Dorchester. By 3:02 a.m., the Comanche eased into the watery cemetery. Its directions were not to pick up survivors, but to screen for enemy submarines. All among the Comanche's rail, the young sailors were somewhat close to trance. They proceeded slowly through lifeless men in life jackets, acres and acres of them. Two things were responsible for saving the lives of so many of the Dorchester's survivors. One was the inspiration provided by the actions and prayers of the four chaplains. The other was Charles W. David Jr. Captain Curry finally gave the order, save the men on the lifeboat. The Comanche would screen for the enemy as best it could, but it was time to start looking for survivors. Only 3 officers trained in rescuing people from the watery stepped forward. Charles, still weak and sick from having a cold, watched the hesitation among the enlisted men. Charles had no obligation to prepare for battle. That was not his assignment. Not for lack of willingness, but because the racism of the day forbade it. Like the 4 chaplains, Alex, John, George, and Clark, Charles saw the situation with a different perspective. In a moment of perfect clarity, Charles chose an act of pure charity. He would save people different from himself. He volunteered to help, and 6 other enlisted men followed. Charles and the small crew realized just how difficult their task would be. The waves had grown violent again. At 6 and 8 feet, they clapped against the hull of the Comanche. The wind grew fierce, the waves more deadly. The Comanche slowed, easing its way to the men in the lifeboat. It was nearly swamped. It held so many sailors that it sat just 8 inches above the surface of the water. The crew had placed a net on the side of the ship for sailors to climb aboard. Charles recognized immediately what needed to be done. He swung over the side and climbed down the net, and they formed a line to extract the sailors from their lifeboat. Charles directed some of the men and largely took charge of the situation. The younger crew member followed. They brought the men to safety. The Comanche is now underway. On the lifeboat, however, Ensign Anderson first heard, then saw his ship leave him. Charles pushed through the guardsmen, sprinting to the control room with heavy legs. He tore the length of the cutter, burst in on the Captain Curry, and explained what was happening. Curry stopped the vessel and ordered the cutter to return to the lifeboat. Charles tied a rope around his waist, and with no protective sea gear on, clambered down the net tied the rope around Anderson, and helped carry him back onto the boat. They continued their search. The ship continued their search, finding and saving small pockets of men. One sailor had slipped and fell in. He lacked the strength to swim back to the cargo net. Charles dove in after him and hoisted him out of the water so the others could pull him up. By this time, Charles ascended the net for the last time. All the symptoms of hypothermia were setting in. His fellow crew members rushed him down to the medical bay. As the Comanche sailed into Greenland, the symptoms never seemed to abate. If anything, they grew worse. On March the 29th, 1943, Charles W. David Jr. passed away from pneumonia brought about from the exposure to the cold and a virus. The night of the rescue, the Escabanda picked up roughly 134 Dorchester survivors. On the Comanche, Charles and a small number of volunteers saved 93 men. This is an excerpt from the book, The Immortals by Stephen T. Collis. I thank Reverend Horn for allowing me to share this with you. As I said, after hearing this last year of a fifth hero, I had to buy the book. Thank you.